All right, well, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for joining. This is kind of being put on by mostly members of the North Florida Livestock Agents Group. And then we also have one of our University of Florida State Extension horse specialists here, Carissa Wickens. And then also a special guest, Stacy Simmons from Florida Department of Agriculture's Office of Ag Water Policy. And she's going to talk with us a little bit about some best management practices. I did want to kind of put in a plug at the very beginning. We do have a course put on by the North Florida Livestock Agents Group online called Equine Academy. It's only $10. It's a significant amount of information. There's about 30 modules in there that go over pretty much everything you would need to know regarding horses. And I can send out that link when we send out our final materials and everything after the program. But if you're interested, that's available for you as well. And we'll go ahead and get started with Stacy Simmons discussing our best management practices and a little bit about FDACS and the Office of Ag Water Policy.
Thank you, Alicia. Appreciate the invite too. Let's see. Here we go. So, opportunity to talk about our program. I work for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services in their Office of Agricultural Water Policy. And we have Best Management Practice Program. And tonight we'll just talk about the equine operations. In the chat, I dropped a link to the manual that is available online. And through the manual, it's a great reference guide put together by industry folks, as well as the department and other stakeholders. There's a steering committee that creates these manuals for us. And I encourage you to take a look at that. The checklist, which is the official enrollment in the BMP program, can be found in the back of that manual. And the way you answer those questions, usually we'll walk through that in a minute here, and field staff generally assist producers with that process. So moving on. Oh, I did want to point out, I'm an environmental manager for this district. We go by the Water Management District's territories. So we fall into the St. Johns River Water Management Territories. And I have 5 field staff that cover those counties within that Water Management District. Okay, just want to point that out. And to advance. Oh boy, hold on one sec. Sorry to give you dizzy. So wonder if everybody even knows what best management practices are. Basically, they're agricultural best management practices are practical measures that producers can take to reduce the amount of fertilizers, animal waste, and other pollutants entering our water resources. So BMPs are designed to improve water quality while maintaining agricultural production. So, sorry about that. So talk a little bit about that enrollment process. If you're interested in enrolling in the program, best to schedule a meeting with our field staff. They'll come out and they'll do a free assessment of your operation to determine what best management practices are applicable to your operation. At that time, we complete that BMP checklist, and you are signing the notice of intent to implement BMPs at that time. We submit that checklist and the NOI to our Office of Ag Water Policy. One thing I didn't put into the notes here is we go by parcel of land. So your property appraiser for the county gives you a designated number for that parcel, and that's how we track the land use and communicate back with our stakeholders such as DEP and the water management districts about land use and ag properties. So we'd be collecting the parcel numbers at that time as well, including that with the checklist and the NOI. We always recommend that, and we provide a copy of this paperwork to the producer, and they keep a copy of the checklist and the signed NOI as their records. So the key to the BMP program is highlighted areas of record keeping, and we give you examples in that manual to follow by. And then, so the second step after you're enrolling, the expectation would be that you're implementing these checklist questions. And we'll review a few of those in a minute, but implement and maintain the applicable BMPs and keep adequate records to maintain a presumption of compliance with the state water quality standards. So that is the benefit of enrolling in the BMP program, one of the benefits. So we'll talk a little bit about the categories. So typically best management practices will include things like nutrient management. I put an example little screenshot from our manual that talks about how you should track your nutrient records. Date, location, the acres you've covered, and the type of grass or forage that you're growing. The formulation and analysis, a formulation would be liquid or granular, and the analysis would be your NPK from your fertilizer bag or from your compost. If it has an analysis, it's considered a fertilizer. The rate pound per acre, and if you have an ag use plan. Sorry, I don't know why that changed. Let me go back. Okay. So we often reference the University of Florida Circular SL 129, and this is a guide for forage grown grasses, and it will give you the recommended rates for the crop that you're growing. We ask that you base the fertilization rate for phosphorus using soil testing. So we encourage and ask you to keep record of when you've pulled soil samples and also tissue samples if you're growing Bahia grass for hay. So illustration of sample of soil and tissue here. And the key part here, I just want to drive home, is keeping the records of all the nutrients applied. That include the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We only collect the nitrogen and phosphorus levels on these fertilization records traditionally. So the next component would be water resource protection or pasture management. This also, if you have irrigated lands, it would include the irrigation management aspects of things. So these practices address the method and scheduling of irrigation events if you have that as an operational practice. Basically, with the land's use for pasture for equine, we always consider subdividing larger pastures to manage vegetation. We also recommend in that guide, or the manual, I should say, a 25-foot non-fertilized vegetative buffer from any wetlands on the property. Let me go back. Also, if there's any streams or springs on the property, of course, a riparian buffer along those waterways. We also take in consideration alternative water sources for the livestock. So this is a water trough here in the picture with some cross fencing behind. And then I wanted to mention the nutrient and manure setback is a recommended 50 foot from any waterway. So that's water resource protection. And then the last component, manure management, also recommending collecting and storing if you're going to be composting. A lot of folks we find just haul off. It's an easier practice for their operation. And that's part of the checklist questions that we do have. We capture how you manage your manure in the checklist. On-site storage of composting, you can see an example here with a nice slab and a cover roof. Also has a little bit of irrigation for getting some water into the process of breakdown. And we also ask, well, keeps changing, automatic. Also ask that you record manure hauler records. So that is included in your BMP record keeping, is how you manage your manure.
Did we lose you there, Stacy?
Yeah, for a minute there, I don't know what happened. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. We were just talking about some record keeping, about keeping records of how you manage your manure is an expectation of your best management practice program checklist. I did want to point out this great reference guide I saw from University of Florida. The link is here, and this is a wonderful explanation of managing horse manure by composting. So I wanted to put that in there. Some opportunities. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about some opportunities, programs administered by various stakeholders that can assist with implementing some of the best management practices that may be outside of your feasibility, technically or financially. So I want to start off, and every guide that we manage, or our manuals, will have these appendices with this information in the back. So you'll be able to find this information again by going to that link and looking at the manual. But I want to start off with the USDA, so the federal side of farm programs. Every county has an NRCS representative, and you can find your local contact here at this link. The NRCS group stands for Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they offer several programs or plans of cost share options. They also offer conservation plans to include soil type, soil mapping, and some technical assistance with erosion and water resource protection. So I wanted to put that in there. And then a few state offices that offer some assistance financially. Programs administered by state and regional entities. So of course, the Florida Department of Agriculture, Office of Agricultural Water Policy offers some assistance in the categories of nutrient management, water resource protection, and irrigation management. And we kind of looked through some of those pictures. So we want to contact field staff with some of your requests, that some of your needs that may be addressed by that. I also wanted to point out that water management districts also have cost share programs. So I think some folks fall into the Swanee Water Management District, and then others in the St. Johns River Water Management District, and they both have very good programs. You can look at their website for contact information. And let's see, for further information of these programs, I've written here, including eligibility criteria for enrollment in the program, please contact soil and water conservation districts, water management districts, or the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And Extension is always a great outreach as well. They certainly can put you in touch with these agencies, and we appreciate the partnership that we have with these great ag agents up in North Florida. So with that, I wanted to leave my contact information. I apologize for not being on screen today, but I encourage you to reach out if you have any further questions. Thank you, Alicia. I'm sorry about the technical interruption.
No problem at all. So we're going to move right into Carissa Wickens, our state horse extension specialist. And she's going to discuss a little bit about managing manure on equine properties through composting.
All right, thank you very much, Alicia. Good evening again, everyone. And thank you, Stacy. We do really value the partnerships we have with our state agencies, our Florida Department of Ag, the Ag Water Policy Office, as well as our water management districts have actually really helped fund and appreciate working on some research, applied research studies with us. Some of those have actually been conducted on horse farms with BMPs, manure management and pasture management. So they're a great resource for all of us working in these areas. So with that, I'm going to start talking a little bit more in depth on managing manure. So one of the strategies that we're going to focus on this evening is management of manure through composting. So this is obviously one method that we can use in terms of trying to more properly store, handle, and then either use or dispose of our manure. There we go. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the whys and hows of composting. So, why is this a good method? What are some of the benefits of composting horse manure? And so I just want you guys to take just a minute to kind of think about the manure on your property, the manure that's generated from your horses. There's a lot of different ways we can think about and look at that manure. We can think of it certainly as waste, as a waste product. A lot of us consider it sort of a nuisance, or maybe our neighbors consider it a nuisance. And then certainly Stacy touched on this a little bit. If we have manure, and certainly if we're land applying that, we're utilizing that potentially as a nutrient source, it may actually, in fact, have a little bit of added value. So it is a source of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And particularly nitrogen is something that we focus on quite a bit in terms of how much the horse is actually excreting in the manure in terms of mitigating nitrate losses to ground and surface waters. It can be a costly disposal issue. So depending on what we are doing with our manure on site, obviously we might be paying a service to haul that off. That certainly has a monthly cost associated with it. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about composting as a method to maybe offset some of that cost. And then certainly when we are, worried about biosecurity and we're taking good care of our horses, manure in some cases, if horses are sick or if we've got parasites, we can have parasites and pathogens in that manure. So sometimes, unfortunately, it can actually be a source of disease or infection. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we all know that manure happens. Just to give you guys an idea of what we're talking about, we're not always just talking about the poop and the urine, but oftentimes if we've got horses in stalls, even part of the day, or if they're in run out sheds, but we use some kind of bedding material, we're talking about a lot of bedding that we accumulate also as we're picking out those stalls. So it's really a combination of their manure, their urine, and the bedding material that we're utilizing. So again, we talked about this as a potential source of nutrients. We'll come back to that idea in just a minute. But in terms of manure management, it really on our part requires responsible action. It's probably the thing that we enjoy least about horse keeping and horse ownership, but it's really one of the most important for the multiple reasons that we just briefly discussed. So we talk about, proper manure storage, and we talk about proper disposition of that manure. Disposition meaning either having it removed or taken off our property off site, or, storing, handling, managing that appropriately, and maybe appropriately land applying it to our pastures and so forth on site. So there's different methods of disposition in terms of what we can do with that manure. So just to give you guys an idea, if we're talking about some of our light breed horses, so quarter horses, Arabians, these horses that weigh maybe around 1,000 to 1,100 pounds, one horse of that size will poop anywhere from 4 to 13 times per day, and they will produce in total around 45 to 50 pounds of manure per day. So if you guys think about this, if we extrapolate this out, 365 days across a year, this one horse, 1,000-pound horse, is producing just a little over 9 tons of manure per year. And per ton, that manure contains approximately 11 pounds of nitrogen, 2 pounds of phosphorus, and roughly 8 pounds of potassium. And that's on a per ton basis. So if you guys can picture this, if you've got maybe your 12 by 12 box stall, if we assembled or compiled all this manure for that year, we would completely fill that 12 by 12 box stall from the floor all the way to the ceiling of the barn. And that's just one horse. Another way to look at this is in cubic feet. So one horse is producing 2.4 cubic feet per day. That's manure plus bedding material, which equals almost 32 cubic yards per year. So it doesn't take very long, unfortunately, to, especially if we've got multiple horses on a property, to get something that looks pretty similar to what you see in that bottom picture on the slide. So that mount manure there. And then again, the reason that this is so important is we all are doing our part to protect our very, very, valuable water resources here in the state of Florida. It's so important to our recreation in the state and to our, economic, in terms of an economic impact in the state of Florida. So protecting water quality is becoming more and more important, and everybody from homeowners to, other types of ag commodities, whether it's row crops, fruit and vegetables, or our horses or our cattle, all of these industries are really trying to contribute and do their part to protect our water resources. So generally speaking, we're trying to prevent nutrient loading to our ground and surface waters, especially, in the North Florida area. We want to protect our springs and our spring sheds. And again, we're really focused mostly on nitrogen and phosphorus. And in terms of nitrogen, we're really focused on nitrate. So trying to prevent nitrate leaching into our groundwater or runoff of those nutrients into our surface waters. So proper management of manure plays a very important role in mitigating these environmental impacts. So why compost as a strategy? So if we can effectively manage our manure through composting, if we can set up a little compost system on our property, we actually get a production of a more homogeneous material. So instead of land applying large flake shavings or a lot of, bedding material with manure and having sort of this ununiform kind of, bulky material to try to work with, we get this much more homogeneous type of material that's easier to spread and overall easier to manage. And as we mentioned, this product, if we can compost effectively, we may turn that manure or that stall waste into a either marketable product or at least a useful end product. So that can be used as a soil amendment in our pasture systems. It can be used as a growth media for roses, or for working with earthworms, for example. And it can also really be considered a slow release fertilizer. So when we compost, really this process, there's just some science here. I'm going to go through that pretty quickly, but ultimately this is the same process as natural decomposition, except that in the case of composting, depending on how we're managing our manure piles, we're enhancing and accelerating the mixing of this manure and bedding material, so that organic waste, with other key ingredients, such that we are optimizing the microbes working in that pile to utilize those organic materials and use those nutrients to break this pile down. So natural decomposition, but we're kind of helping it along. So when we effectively compost a manure pile, we can actually reduce the total volume of waste as much as 25 to 50%. So that's really, really helpful because it's reducing the total amount of stall waste or manure that we then have to further handle or manage in some other way, or have hauled off or dispose of. So reducing volume is one of the biggest benefits here. But the other benefit is when we heat piles, and we'll talk about some of the ingredients and some of the how-tos of composting just in a minute here. But when we do this properly, we heat these piles to a level, a temperature where we then can destroy pathogens, weed seeds, and parasites. So then if we are going to spread that or land apply it or further dispose of it, we've really helped kind of reduce those pathogens and other undesirable things that might be in the manure or the stall waste. So ultimately, the product that we get is this very rich soil-like humus sort of appearing material here that you see in the photo. So that's the goal. We want to transform that stall waste, that manure, into this rich soil-like media. All right, so a little bit of the how-tos. We're going to go through this fairly quickly, but then we'll guide you guys. There's lots of resources that we have through University of Florida that will really help you not only construct or design a composting system for your farm if you choose to try this method of manure management, but we'll also give you some tips on troubleshooting. As much as this is a science, there's a lot of art and trial and error involved. The more we talk to folks that have tried this, it takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of tweaking of the methods, if you will. So we'll give you kind of a general how-to, and then we'll make sure that we guide you to some good resources. So Stacy already mentioned this in her talk about BMPs as we got started this evening, but location of our manure storage areas, of our piles, whether we're going to just stockpile and keep it there, or if we're going to compost or manage the manure in some other way, location is really important. So we definitely want to find an area on the farm that is fairly flat, away from low-lying areas. Especially we've had a lot of rain even these last couple of weeks in many of our areas across the state. So those low-lying areas where water collects, we certainly don't want to be amassing or piling our stall waste and manure in those areas. Generally speaking, and a lot of our manuals will guide you on proper setbacks. So we talk about having this manure storage area or our piles 300 feet away from public potable wells, 200 feet away from water courses, so those open sources of water and sinkholes, 100 feet away from private potable wells, and certainly, if we can, as we plan our manure management site on our farm, we try to have it out of view and downwind from neighbors as much as possible, so that they're not, on the backside of that odor. When we manage the pile, when we talk about composting and sort of the how-tos of composting, we need a minimum pile size of at least 1 cubic yard. So if you guys think about what's that size look like, we're talking about a pile about the size of kind of your average washer or dryer in your laundry room. Okay, so 1 cubic yard is about the size of that washer. We talked a little bit about temperatures. We want these piles to heat and maintain some what we call the thermophilic range of 130 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. We want to reach those temperatures and then maintain those piles at that temperature for about 21 days in total to make sure that we are destroying those pathogens and weed seeds. And it will also help with parasite control within the manure piles. When we have temperature drops, the best thing we can do if it's not maintaining temperature, the pile may not be big enough. And we also can turn, or what we call aerate, those piles either manually, by hand, or with a front end loader, a little bucket on your tractor, or again, sometimes with pitchfork and shovel, but that gets pretty labor intensive. So a little bit of small farm equipment is very, very beneficial in doing this properly and not being so much of a drain on your time. So aerating and getting some oxygen, so those little microbes in there can do their job. This is mostly an aerobic process, so those microorganisms do need some oxygen. They need air infiltrating those manure piles, so it helps them decompose and break that material down. We do want to add some water. We want these piles to be moist, but not oversaturated. So if they're too wet or if they're too dry, they may not heat properly and they may not decompose as quickly. And if we get piles that are really, really hot and really, really dry, we can't even have some spontaneous combustion. You'll actually see these piles smoking and kind of smoldering. So we want to try to avoid that. So we can add water. That's pretty easy to do. Sometimes if you're taking wheelbarrow loads of stall waste, as you're cleaning stalls, you can take the spent water in your horse's buckets, and rather than just dumping it down the drain or dumping it on the ground, you can add it to the manure, like the wheelbarrow full of manure, and that can help moisten the pile. So a good rule of thumb, a little bit of the art to this is we like to take a little handful of our compost, and when you squeeze it in your hand, you want it to feel moist. You don't want it overly dry where it's going to crumble and just fall out of your hand, but you don't want it overly saturated. And by that, I mean, if you squeeze it and the water is easily running down your hand and down your wrist, it's much too wet. So we like to think about this compost, the ideal moisture content is about the consistency of a wrung out sponge. So that's just sort of a rule of thumb. And then we can also amend these piles with some nitrogen. If they're not breaking down, they're not composting well, it might be that we've got too much carbon in the pile. So wood sources, like especially if we're cleaning stalls that have wood material, wood bedding, especially those big flake shavings, those tend to take a lot longer to break down. We're adding too much carbon to the system at that point. So we might have to just get some raw manure or add a little bit of commercial fertilizer. You can actually put some nitrogen back in that pile to help that process. The ideal ratio is 25 to 30 to 1 parts carbon to nitrogen. So horse manure by itself, just sort of raw horse manure, as we're taking that and picking it up out of the paddocks, it's pretty close to that ideal ratio. But again, it kind of depends on our bedding material. And I'll show you guys an example of that in just a minute. So ideal ratio is that 25 to 30 to 1 parts carbon to nitrogen. The picture on the bottom there, it just shows you guys we can buy these commercial, they're a little bit more industrial strength, long stem compost thermometers. Those are really great to have because even if you accidentally hit the thermometer in your pile with the front end loader of your tractor, they tolerate some beating. They are pretty robust when we get those long stemmed, thick, more commercial or industrial compost thermometers. So they cost anywhere from $90 to maybe $120, but it's a pretty good investment just to help you track temperatures and make sure that your compost is doing well. All right, so just really quickly, this is actually from some master's thesis research of one of our other faculty members, her student. They were interested in looking at the nutrient composition of different manures, basically horse stall waste from different facilities based on the type of bedding that they were using. So if you guys look here in this table, we've got the nutrient composition of compost when it includes hay, straw, or wood bedding material. And so we talked about that ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio being right around 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And if you guys see the hay and the straw, pretty much gets us there at that ideal ratio. However, when we've got a lot of wood material as bedding substrate in these piles, you guys can see that now we're well above that ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio. So in that case, that's where we may have to amend those piles or that compost bin system with some other source of nitrogen. I know some of our horse folks, if you have backyard birds, if you've got poultry, adding a little bit of poultry litter to your compost can be very helpful because chicken manure is much higher in nitrogen compared to the horse manure. So that's another great way. If you've got chickens on your place, you can actually amend your piles with some nitrogen in the chicken manure. Determining bin size. So I've talked about composting in general, but for small farms especially, you guys, it's a little bit easier and just more user-friendly to manage this. If you have 2 or 3 horses, it's really great if you can construct a 2 or 3 bin system so that you've got like 2 or 3 compost bins that you can assemble your manure or your stall waste. And then it just kind of controls and keeps everything contained. And it makes it kind of a nice go-to place on your property where you can really turn and monitor and manage these piles much more effectively. So this is an example of how we would determine our bin size. So this is an example using a small property, a small equine operation with 2 horses. So we talked a little bit about the amount of manure that's produced each day from each horse. And so if we talk about that 2 cubic feet of manure and bedding produced per horse times 2 horses, per day, we've got 4 cubic feet that's produced that we have to manage and deal with. So then we want to try to set up a storage system where we've got about at least a 4 months, storage capacity for this stall waste. So 4 months is 120 days. And so then in terms of calculating your total amount of manure generated that you're going to be managing, we've got the 4 cubic feet per day times 120 days. That gives us 480 cubic feet. If we want a 2 bin system, we can then calculate the size of each bin. We take the 480 cubic feet divided by 2 bins. So each bin needs to be 240 cubic feet. So then each bin needs to be an 8 by 8 by 4 foot bin. And I'll show you guys some nice examples of a couple of these bin systems that some of our local horse farms, some of our small scale folks, recreational horse owners have actually put together in order to do their composting. So here's a couple examples. Some are a little bit more fancy and a little bit more involved and cost a little bit more money. The picture that you guys see here on the slide on the left, this is very conveniently located right behind the barn. So as they're cleaning their stalls, it's easy access. They did put down a slab of concrete, so they have impervious surface here. And then they've assembled just 2 fairly large wooden bins. So usually how this works is you can put your raw stall waste in the first bin, you let that accumulate, and you can start monitoring the temperatures and looking at that pile. But then maybe after about 30, 60 days, depending on how your temperatures are looking, once this is full, you can move this over to the second bin. It frees up your first bin to start putting raw stall waste, and now you're actively composting in the second bin. So you can start to get a more finished, that humusy product that then you can do something else with, maybe land apply it to your pastures, for example. So the 2 bin system can work really well, especially if you only have maybe 2 horses. And then you can see this other example on the right-hand side. They found a nice flat area between the barn and the pastures here. This is each bin is smaller, but this is a nice 3 bin system. And then they've got tarps that they can pull over during heavy rain events. So obviously covering these piles again, so they don't get overly saturated and we don't have a lot of runoff of nutrients from these piles. Covering with a tarp is very inexpensive, fairly easy, and a good plan in terms of managing your manure. So this is a nice 3-bin system. They've got mats kind of underneath and at the front of the bins. And then if you guys look at this last bin, that's actually kind of that dark, more soil-like material in this more finished compost bin. Couple other examples. These are some nice examples of some very quick and easy and very inexpensive assembly of 2- and 3-bin systems. They've actually used garden lattice work and just some old boards and posts laying around the farm. So they did not even go out and purchase brand new materials. They just utilized what they had at the farm. The other thing that can be done is you can cut slits in your post so that these boards can be lifted out. So you can kind of keep everything contained when you're not actively managing the pile, keeping that material in its place in the bin, but then you can easily slide out those boards for easy access at the front of the bins. And then this picture on the right does show you a nice example of sort of the first bin has that raw stall waste material. Second bin is kind of more actively composting. So they're turning, watching temperatures on that second bin. And then the third bin is just that really nice dark soil-like material, that finished compost. Again, it depends on the bedding substrate that you're using, but when we have a lot of wood bedding or shavings, it may take that 3 to 4 months to be able to really compost and effectively start having that break down and giving you that nice finished product. So that's why kind of a rule of thumb is to maybe have at least that 4-month storage capacity in mind. And then this is just one other example. Again, a little bit fancier. This 3-bin system, this was brand new wood, brand new material. So this system to put together was about $1,500. But this was for a property that at the time had 4 horses. They're now down to 3 horses. But they actually, even with 3 horses, you guys, they don't have any trouble filling these 3 bins, just with picking out paddocks almost every day. And then there is part of the summer, their horses are in stalls for about half the day. So just with that material alone, they're pretty easily filling these bins. But they actively compost. They do check temperatures. They have a small tractor and a little spreader. So they do use it as a soil amendment to reapply to their paddocks. And then this is a really neat example. This is an older couple that has 2 horses. This is on a little ranchette, a farm in an equestrian neighborhood in Ocala. This is what we call an adapted O2 compost system. So there's actually a company called O2 Compost that has these static forced air compost systems. But this couple kind of looked at that system and came up with their own design. So this is a 4-bin system. They actually have a little hydraulic cart. And so they're just mucking out 2 stalls every day. And they take that material and they just kind of dump it into the top of the bin, but they don't turn this at all. They actually use the PVC pipe and like a little blow up house pump, an air pump, and they inject air into the pile. And so that's how they introduce or aerate and bring air or oxygen into the piles, but they don't physically have to turn it with any equipment or any labor or time. So that's what we call this little adapted O2 compost system. But it works very, very well for them. It takes them about 30 days to fill up one of these bins. They let it sit and they inject the air and kind of monitor it a little bit. And then after about 3 months, it's ready to go out on the pasture. I mentioned some troubleshooting tips. We've talked a little bit about those as we've gone along, but there's some key questions. If your piles aren't breaking down well, some of the symptoms are, compost won't get hot. The compost has a foul smell, it kind of has an odor to it, which it shouldn't if we're composting correctly. Or the compost pile just doesn't seem to be breaking down, or it's really, really slow and taking a lot of time. This is a chart. There's a manual that's available, the Small Scale Florida Equine Operations BMP manual. So if you guys need access to that, I'm sure we can provide some links, but they give you a cause and a solution. So for example, if the pile isn't getting hot, here's an example, it may be too dry. So you can add some moisture, add some water back into your manure. If the pile is too wet, you may have to add more bulking materials, maybe some leaves, leaf chaff, maybe adding a little bit more bedding material or spent hay that the horse isn't eating, something that'll kind of bulk up and add to that pile. So those are some examples of some of that troubleshooting. So just to finish off, kind of a little summary here on this topic. Manure management is very important. It's an aspect of our horse ownership and equine facility management that we really need to be careful we're not ignoring. It's important for horse health as well, because again, that can be a source of pathogens and parasites. But obviously, just in terms of water quality protection, and certainly for aesthetics of our farm, doing something in terms of properly storing and managing the manure is very helpful. And composting is a tool that we can utilize. So in composting, we're speeding up that decomposition of the horse waste with some added benefits. So it's essentially recycling that organic material. So the waste that the horse is generating, we're finding some recyclability and being able to reuse some of that material. It will decrease the odor. And the biggest benefit really is, just reducing the overall volume that we have to deal with. And then we mentioned it can be used as a soil amendment. So if we incorporate that into our pastures, it really helps the soil improve its water holding capacity. And it really brings some of that organic material back into our very sandy soils. And then composting doesn't need to be complicated. You guys can really, tailor and customize a composting system to your specific situation or property. Monitoring the piles and making adjustments along the way can help you improve the process. And again, there is some art in addition to some science to that, but we've got many, many resources available to help you guys get started. So with that, I think maybe at the end, maybe we can take some questions.
I have a question, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
So you mentioned getting that carbon and nitrogen ratio right and adding commercial fertilizer. So
Yeah.
if commercial fertilizer is not available, I guess there's been a lot of issues. I'm hearing stories about the shelves being empty with it. Can you recommend anything else, or are you aware of anything else to add to kind of add that nitrogen without adding carbon?
So that's where, like if you have horses that, especially if they're on smaller paddocks, just going and picking up some of their raw manure without any bedding material, you can add some of that fresh manure into the pile. Again, horse manure is not very, very high in nitrogen. It's usually about 1% to 2% nitrogen, but that will be, sort of more of a straight nitrogen source that you can add in. I mentioned the poultry manure. So yes, definitely if you have neighbors or if you yourself have some backyard poultry, that's a great, poultry litter is a great amendment because it's usually higher in nitrogen. So those are two kind of more natural examples, Stephen, of what we can add. Probably, even if we're already doing maybe some kitchen, food scrap composting, there's some other things just naturally that we can add back into the pile that can also incorporate some nitrogen.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we'll let Cassidy and Paulette, they're our next speakers. I want to make sure they have enough time. So maybe we can come back at the end. As long as you guys want to ask questions, I think some of us will stay on for a bit tonight as well. But thank you.
All right. Good evening. My name is Paulette Tomlinson, and I'm the Ag and Natural Resources agent here in Columbia County. And tonight, as Dr. Wicken said, Cassidy and I are going to talk a little bit about pasture management for your horses. And let me make sure I can move. So first of all, it's topics that I'm going to cover this evening are why do we need a pasture? What type of pasture do you have? And why do we need to manage it? That's probably the biggest question. And then we'll talk a little bit about managing the fields through using soil sampling and some of what Dr. Wicken said about fertilization, maybe even using some of that composted manure. And we'll definitely talk a little bit about stocking rate. So why do we need a pasture? I mean, who wants to go get on a tractor and have to establish one and have it? Well, obviously, for lack of a better thing, horses require it. There are nutrient requirements that horses have, and we may supply that through added grain or some other kind of feed. But they have a requirement, and they also have a requirement for a forage to keep their digestive system working. If horses basically will consume somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5% of their body weight every day in terms of forage dry matter. And what that actually means, because we always talk about dry matter and people are like, well, yeah, what does that mean in terms of how much grass are they going to consume? Well, in pounds of hay, we're looking at somewhere about 20, for a 1,000-pound animal, you're looking about 20 pounds of hay or 50 to 100 pounds of grass. And that's every day. That they're not skipping, that's every day. So if you've got a horse out there on pasture and that's all that you're doing with it, you're going to need enough grass there so that that animal can maintain itself. Dr. Wickens mentioned something about that horses produce about 50 pounds of manure every single day. And in my studies of nutrition, it's always about calories in, calories out. So whatever goes in is going to come out. And you definitely are going to have a lot of manure the more that they eat, obviously. So we have different types of pastures. Most of us have just a grass pasture, but some of you might have a small area that you maybe put in place that you can put the animal in and take it back out, and that would be a legume pasture. This is a perennial peanut. Or like I said, most people are using Pensacola Bahia or Argentine Bahia. And then obviously we have the option during the summer or winter months, we can add in those warm season annuals or cool season annuals, and again, supplement the forage diet for our horses. So there's a lot of different cultivars. The most widely used species that we do use in permanent pasture is going to be Bahia grass. Now this is actually a picture of a Bermuda grass hayfield, but because I didn't have a really good picture of Bahia grass, but most of the time we recommend Pensacola, Argentine, or maybe Tifton 9. Each one has its own characteristic, and there's a few others. We have UF Riata. One of the things about a grazing system is that we would like to have forage from the spring all the way through first frost. And most of our most of our varieties of Bahia grass, the curve is kind of an up and down. We get most of our forage being produced in that July, August period, and then it tapers off, there in September, pretty much shuts off. UF Riata, some of the newer varieties that we have, they can actually extend your grazing all the way through that first frost period. They don't worry too much about the day length, which is what causes our Bahia grass to go dormant. So that's one thing. We got to know what kind of culture or what pasture that we have. And then why do we want to manage it? This was, it's pretty simple. Once you establish a pasture, you don't want to lose it. Whether you bought into your place or had to establish the pasture yourself, that established pasture is the most important and most expensive phase of a pasture. So once you have it, you want to try and definitely keep it. And I've been to a lot of horse places and been to some that or driven by some that they just weren't managing it properly. And so they were losing that grass pretty much on a daily basis, it seemed. One of the things about managing your fields, and if you look kind of closely at this picture, it really shows kind of what goes on. If you don't manage your pasture, you can go from this nice green to this desert looking, and here in Florida, it'll just be beach sand most of the time. But soil testing is critical. One thing that I should have done was put up here where you can test. You can actually do a soil test. We can help you through the extension office. But also when you, never mind, I'll get back to that in a minute. When you do your soil test, you're going to get, number one, a pH of what your soil is. And that is what's going to tell us whether or not you're going to lime your pasture. I have had a lot of people over the years talk to me about, I'm going to go lime. Fertilizer is really high, so I'm just going to go put some lime out. Well, lime raises the pH of the soil. Well, if you're already in the pH zone that you need to be in for maintaining your pasture, if you put more lime out there, you're beginning to move that pH to a level that could cause your pasture to basically decline in growth instead of increase in growth. So it's always critical that you do a soil test and then be sure and take a look at what your pH is. A soil test from the University of Florida or from Waters Laboratory or someplace else, they're going to give you what the nutrient levels are in the pasture. Now, the university soil test results will not give you a nitrogen analysis. And the reason for that is that the soil scientists know that it takes X amount of pounds of nitrogen to elicit a response. And so you're based on whatever your production system is. If you don't need a lot of grass, then there'll be a minimal amount of nitrogen needing to be applied. Or if you're really intensive grazing and need a lot of forage produced, then you may be hitting adding nitrogen after each and every grazing period. So you would have a higher level of nitrogen being applied over the year. Obviously, you want to fertilize accordingly. More is not necessarily better, especially this year. Fertilizer prices are outrageous, to say the least. At the beginning of the year, the same 6 acres that I was doing in a trial here recently, it went from applying 40 pounds of nitrogen plus phosphorus and potassium at $60 an acre to over $100 an acre within a 3-month period. That's huge. So you definitely want to test your soil and see if you actually need anything. I think they're putting in the chat about the livestock waste testing lab down at UF, which is also the soil testing area. You can actually have your manure tested at that laboratory so that you'll know what it is that you're applying to your property if you're going to use composted manure. You'll also need to keep those results, as Stacy mentioned in the first talk, to maintain your records on your property for your BMPs. The next step is grazing management. When you're managing your fields, you really need to know how much forage are you removing and what does it look like if you don't move those animals. And again, this picture, if you don't manage your stocking rate, you're going to wind up with a dirt field. Stocking rate typically for us is about 1 horse. That's 1 horse per 2 to 3 acres. I know here in Columbia County, I always recommend 3 acres because we normally have more, well, people want to put more horses on a smaller amount of area, but the problem with putting horses on a smaller amount of area is the way that they graze and the fact that their hooves cleave the ground so bad and cause root damage. And it takes time for that grass to recoup from both grazing and the hoof damage so that it begins producing forage again. So watch your stocking rates. The next thing is that if you're not soil testing and fertilizing properly and managing your grazing, you're going to wind up with a weed problem. And that is where Cassidy's going to talk to you a little bit more about that here in just a second. So in conclusion, managing your pasture is really a simple routine each year. Set your calendar, as Stacy mentioned early in the program, that keeping records is important, and having a calendar of events is one of those things that you can do. When do you soil sample? You want to do that maybe before the spring hits. The other thing is that you don't have to sample your field every single year. A permanent pasture can be sampled once every 2 to 3 years, depending on what you're amending it with, fertilizing with and everything. You're probably going to want to rotate your fields or your paddocks once you get into a routine of how much forage that particular paddock or field can maintain. Then you rotate your animals accordingly. You might want to plant annual pastures if you're able to. Depending on how much acreage that you do have, even if you set aside a ½ acre, that you can either overseed your Bahia grass, and that takes some extra tools or implements to do that, but it definitely could pay off for you if you need some extra grass and would like to do that in the wintertime. Not so much in the summer, but definitely in the wintertime. Drag in the field to spread the manure. If you're leaving horses out there quite a bit and you've got piles here and there, as one soil scientist said to me, The nutrients need to be spread around the pasture. That's the reason why she recommends fertilizing, because a lot of times whenever you're just leaving your pasture so that the either whatever cows are leaving or goats are leaving, it's not always in the area that it really needs it. So you might need to drag your field if you're have that ability to do so. It definitely helps. It also cuts down on perhaps flies and other kind of parasites. Excuse me. And then of course you want to fertilize and lime as a soil test results dictate, and give your pastures a rest. Let them recover from grazing and any kind of things that you're doing. So I'll answer any questions, and I think there were a couple in the chat. Let me look real quick. Can you get more horses per acre if you're doing rotational grazing? 3-acre split? You can, but you've really got to, you can rotate or do rotational grazing, and you can definitely get more out of rotational grazing if you're managing your pastures properly. The key is going to what you've really got to do is match how much grass that you're producing and how much the horses are taking off. We can discuss that a little bit later and more in depth. There's a lot of publications that are written, and I don't think we've mentioned it here yet, but you definitely want to look at some of our EDIS publications. If somebody wants to type that into the chat, or I will a little bit later, that's definitely a place to get some of these types of questions answered. But hopefully that tells you, yes, you can increase more horses per acre, but you've just got to manage that grass accordingly in that field. Is there anything else? Seeing none. Cassidy, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, it's working. All right. Hi, my name is Cassidy Dawson. I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent in Clay County. And tonight I'm going to follow up on the pasture management discussion with some talk on weed management. So when it comes to pasture management, weed control is probably going to be one of the top things that's on our mind. So very briefly tonight, I'm going to talk about weed control, some things to keep in mind, and then we'll cover a few major weeds you might be seeing right now and later on in the summer. So just to keep us on track, we'll start with why we control weeds, talk about prevention and scouting, and then get into classifying weeds to help us identify them and choose the right control method. We'll talk about weed seasonality and when to control weeds, and then a little bit about control methods and herbicides as well, and then go through identifying a couple common pasture weeds if we have time. So why do we control weeds? I'm sure we can all agree that weeds are a huge pain, but why do they bother us so much? Well, for one, they cost us a lot of money. They limit and hinder pasture establishment. They reduce forage quality and yield by shading out grasses and taking up space. And they can also be poisonous and harm livestock, which puts us out even more money on vet bills. So prevention should definitely be one of our priorities when it comes to managing weeds in the pasture. Unintentional transport of weed seeds onto your property is a huge source for weed problems. This happens easily through equipment, hay, feed, grass seed, and livestock move weeds also when they're as they move through a pasture or between pastures. So we want to have some management protocols in place to limit this as best we can. Always rinse and clean equipment when you're moving it from place to place and even pasture to pasture if you have any weed problems you want to isolate. Avoid purchasing hay heavily contaminated with weeds. And scouting is very important, and is just the process of walking or driving pastures periodically to see what weeds you're dealing with and find problems before they become super severe. So being able to identify or at least classify weeds is important for scouting, which we'll get into next. And one of our best methods for weed prevention is having a healthy forage stand to begin with, so that weeds don't have the space to move in and establish in our pastures, which is kind of a lot of what Paula just finished talking about. So to optimize forage production, we want to keep up with our pH and soil fertility that was mentioned, and that can mean soil testing and fertilizing properly, all which was just covered. So The first step to scouting and identifying weed problems is being able to identify weed species and types. This will point you in the right direction when it comes to how to control them and herbicide selection. So there are 3 main types of weeds that you're going to be battling, and the first is broadleaf. These are what you probably think of when you think plant. They have a variety of leaf shapes, netted veins, and they also have showy flowers. Grasses have narrow upright leaves, parallel veins, and rounded stems. And since our forage is typically also a grass, these can be a little bit harder to control with selective herbicides. And finally, we have sedges, which can be identified by their solid triangular stems, and they also have leaf groups of 3. So it's important to classify weeds on this level because these types of plants will all be controlled with different types of selective herbicides. So weed seasonality is another important thing to keep in mind that will help us with identification of weeds and also let us know when it's best to control them. Annuals complete their life cycle within 1 year. So we have our summer annuals, which germinate in the spring and summer and are killed by the frost. And we also have winter annuals, which germinate in late summer and fall, and a lot of times put out a lot of growth in early spring, then end up getting scorched and in the summer and kind of die off. So winter annuals are a lot of the weeds that were giving us a hard time right around this time, like our fireweed, chickweed, and wild radish. So biennials have a 2-year life cycle. So they form a rosette in that first year and then flower in the second year. So we want to try to control biennials in their rosette stage before flowering. Some examples that you might be familiar with are thistles and horseweed. And perennials, which live for over 2 years and can flower multiple times, they can be further classified into warm or cool season based on when they're actively growing. And we have a lot of warm season perennials that we deal with, but there are also some cool season perennial weeds like some of our nut sedges and red sorrel as well. So here's a little calendar. So weed seasonality gives us a great idea of when it is a good time to apply herbicides. So for herbicides to work the best, we want plants to be actively growing, or else we're wasting product and time and we may get no results at all. So right now in April, you can see we're right in that peak weed control time of the year where we can be dealing with winter and summer annuals and biennials and perennials. So it can be controlling summer annuals and perennials into midsummer. And there's another period to catch winter annuals in the fall, which is ideal to get them right at germination. But the goal is to develop a routine that works for your operation, like Paulette kind of touched on. You should be aware of what weed problems you have and develop a plan to prevent those same problems from happening the next year. And this way we steer away from simply reactively applying herbicides, which can make weed problems much harder to control. So a lot goes into weed control other than herbicides, and it's best to use a diversity of methods to avoid herbicide resistance and maximize control. Cultural control methods is that management of our pastures to optimize our forage production and have a healthy stand, which we already kind of went over. So we want to make sure we're growing a forage species that's good for our conditions, and avoiding overgrazing is really important, as Paulette mentioned as well. So mechanical control are those types of physical weed control methods, such as mowing, pulling weeds, and cultivating. Pulling weeds is not usually an efficient method for pasture, so we're primarily talking about mowing, which, depending on what your weed problem is, it's not always necessarily a good thing. Mowing can often make certain weed problems worse by spreading seeds, especially if plants have already seeded out. So we definitely want to use mowing when we can, but make sure it's the right time, and keep in mind we will likely need to mow several times to drain those plant energy stores. If not, they're just going to keep popping back up. So one example of this is dog fennel. Dog fennel densities can be reduced if mowed before they're flowering, but mowing after flowering just causes a huge mess and makes the problem a lot worse by spreading that seed everywhere. And then we have biological control, which is worth mentioning, but not really a priority for any of our pasture systems. So biological control is the use of biotic agents, often herbivorous insects or pathogens, to control weed problems. So biological control is not very common for many Florida pasture weeds, and it's not something that's available to purchase for your pasture. But there have been releases of a certain insect for tropical soda apple control in Florida, which is an invasive toxic weed. So biological control, if it is able to be used, takes a lot of time to provide control, and it doesn't completely eradicate weed problems, but more so reduces them to a manageable level. And researchers start to consider biological control as an option for highly problematic invasive weeds that have the potential to spread and cause tons of damage. So it's not something that we're thinking about all the time when it comes to weed control. And then we have what ends up being one of our primary control methods, and that is chemical control, which involves the use of herbicides. So just a few things to keep in mind for herbicides. We definitely want to avoid applying too much or the wrong herbicide, which brings up risks of resistance in our weeds and could also cause runoff into the environment, which we should manage to avoid as best we can, just as Stacy discussed in more detail earlier. And first and foremost, we always need to read the label before applying anything. This will tell you just about everything you need to know: what to use the product against, what crops it can be safely applied to, and any required PPE or mixing instructions, and application rates as well. So the timing of application also plays a huge role in how effective herbicides are going to be. There are our pre-emergent herbicides that are applied before germination, and post-emergent herbicides that are applied after weed seeds germinate and emerge. So the smaller the seedlings are, usually the more successful the herbicide will be. So always attempt to apply early if you can. And for perennial weeds that are already established, herbicides are more effective after blooming. So herbicides can be broadcasted or sprayed over an entire pasture, or can be applied in a spot treatment to individual plants. Spot treatments are usually a little bit cheaper, but it really depends on how severe the weed problem is, which one is going to work best for you. When we're selecting an herbicide, and this also goes into reading the label, our major considerations are going to be what type of forage crop we have, what our weed issue is, and of course the cost. And that thinking about that cost of herbicides and weed control brings us to another important point I'd like to stress, and that is that we call weed control and weed management and control for a reason. It's not an effort to eradicate all weeds in your pasture. For one, it would be entirely tedious and nearly impossible, but it's just not economical, and it's not necessary. We want to get out of our pastures and forage for our livestock around what we're putting in when it comes to management costs, which is already kind of difficult to do, especially for us horse owners. So don't get stressed out about having a perfectly clear, pristine pasture. We want to control weeds when weeds are at or right before reaching a threshold where we can invest in weed control and save ourselves the cost of lost forage grass. It's definitely a balancing act, and it can take time to develop a system that works for your operation, but developing that routine that works for you and then editing from there, that's the goal. So I have just a few weeds to go through. I know we're kind of running quick on time, but I'll just go over a couple that I'm seeing a lot of right now. And so the first is going to be fireweed. I'm seeing this everywhere, and I've gotten quite a few calls about it. This is a winter annual, so it likes to take off in its growth in early spring. And if you know fireweed, you know it's covered in stinging hairs that cause a lot of pain. But other than that, it's not toxic to livestock, but it can cause a lot of stress if they do graze it by accident. So do not mow bad outbreaks of fireweed. It will only cause worse problems down the line. So some herbicides that are successful in controlling fireweed are Grazon Next HL, Pasture Guard HL, and Remedy Ultra. And I'm also seeing a lot of this. You might notice red sorrel by seeing kind of a reddish tint over a pasture. And red sorrel is a winter perennial, and they also have a very close relative, which looks very similar, called heartwing dock or sorrel, I believe, which looks pretty much the same, and that one is an annual. So these weeds are an indicator weed. They typically like acidic soil, and after they started to flower, they are a lot more difficult to control. So you might not have much luck attempting to control it now, but you'll know to keep an eye out early next year and consider soil testing and applying lime this year, so they'll be less likely to come up and cause a problem. Okay, so just a couple toxic weeds I thought might be important to cover as well. We should definitely talk about toxic weeds because we don't want our livestock to be at risk. And while livestock typically avoid toxic plants unless they have inadequate forage available, it's still an important thing to look out for while we're scouting. So just because you find these plants doesn't necessarily mean your livestock have been grazing them, but it's definitely something to take note of and try to eradicate the issue. So the first is creeping indigo, which has a creeping growth habit and compound alternate leaves, and it can be easily missed because it's so low to the ground, but control is usually not too difficult with several types of herbicides once you find it. Okay, next I have showy crotalaria. It's another toxic weed that has these yellow showy flowers and often distinct seed pods, and it can get pretty tall as well, but control can be achieved with Pasture HL and remedy herbicides. Another one is bracken fern. It's a toxic perennial that's found in shaded areas. Herbicides that control it are chaparral and Cimarron Plus and metsulfuron. And then I also have coffee senna is a toxic weed that I've seen a lot of in my area. This is a shrub-like plant that gets decently tall, and if you control them when they're small, it's typically pretty easy, but you can still control coffee senna when it gets larger with Grazon Next HL, which provides pretty decent control. And so that is all I have. So please let me know if you have any questions. I've put up my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me, and definitely reach out to your local extension agent as well if you need any help identifying or controlling weeds. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight.
Perfect. Thank you, Cassidy. All right, so let's talk a little bit about biosecurity at the barn, and then we'll have Stephen finish this up with some disaster emergency preparedness. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what is biosecurity, and it's pretty simple. It's basically just disease prevention. These are precautions that we can take to limit the spread of disease when we're working with horses, whether that be horses on our own operation, other horses around us, or even horses we're just visiting in the equine community as a whole. A couple things that we should focus on in our own barns are your stalls, that your horses should be stalled in the same stall each time. I generally see this in most barns, but sometimes you just kind of let your horse walk into whichever barn or whichever stall they find first. And in a disease management kind of thing, sometimes that can't be the greatest because horses that may not generally have interactions with each other can be sharing the same equipment, and that's how diseases can be spread. If one of them gets sick in the stall, spreads their germs in there, and then the next day they don't go in that same stall and another horse is in there, that horse can pick up the germs. Kind of a thing I like to say to operations that have horses that aren't necessarily housed together in the same pasture. So if you have separate paddocks that only have groups of horses, then those horses that are in the same paddocks together and have a chance to be nose to each other should be stall mates. So they should be housed in stalls next to each other. And that way you only ever have horses that are nose to each other in the barn and in the pastures. And again, that's just a way to maintain a small, spread of disease if you were to have a disease breakout there. Of course, if you're getting any new animals in the barn, they should be quarantined for a minimum of 14 days. Typically, we like to see 30 days or longer. You should know their vaccine history, their health history and such anytime you get a horse in the barn. If you don't know that, then the longer quarantine is going to be best. Quarantine being a stall that's, has no other contact with other horses around them. It's completely separate. They should be in a paddock that's only accessible to that horse. So not like that horse is out in the morning and then another horse is in that stall or paddock in the afternoon. During that whole quarantine period, that animal needs to be the only animal with access to those areas. And equipment should be the same. They should only have access to their drinking buckets, feed buckets, grooming equipment, anything like that should be used on that horse and that horse only. So your tack and equipment is going to be similar, where each horse or group of commingled horses should share the same equipment. This goes for your grooming equipment mostly. So brushes, curry combs, hoof picks, and such should all be used by the same horse, or horses, again, that are commingled or have a chance to be nose to nose to each other, because if they're sharing diseases in the pasture, having separate grooming equipment is not really going to make a difference there. Buckets and hay feeders should be labeled with the horse's names and not shared, especially water buckets and such. Water buckets and feed buckets are the most likely to be places for disease transmission, because most diseases are transmissible through bodily fluids, which could be, slobber and such in a water bucket per se. And then if you'd like to have kind of go above and beyond, then separate or dedicated halters, lead ropes, blankets, tack, even if you have the ability to, or at least saddle blankets and saddle pads should be individualistic to the horse. And bits especially should be individual to the horse. And that way, whatever is going into their mouth has only been in that horse's mouth and is not being traded out between a bunch of other horses. I understand as a horse person, this probably isn't something that most of us do for a small barn with only 2 or 3 horses. But when you get into those larger barns, that biosecurity is really important when it comes to your tack and equipment. Traveling is going to be one of the biggest aspects when it comes to biosecurity, because if your horses never leave your farm or your operation or boarding facility, then the likelihood of them getting a disease is very little. They still have access to vector-borne diseases, which we'll talk a little bit about. But horses that are communicable from horse to horse are going to be, when you're traveling to other equine events or trail riding places, things where other horses are going to be. When you're on the road, the best thing to do is always bring your own buckets to feed and water your animals in, your own hay nets or hay feeders, your own panels, or kind of overnight stalls and such, if you can. Take precautions anytime your horses are going to be commingling with other horses. You want to avoid common areas. I never let my horses drink out of communal water troughs. That's number one, way you might see disease spread in a large equine facility like that. If my horse is going to be housed in a stall, like say I were to go to the Southeast Livestock Pavilion in Ocala, and I'm going to put my horse in a stall, I'll probably just run a Clorox wipe over the bars, maybe anything that other horses may have mouthed or touched on. And then if the stall isn't clean, I'll definitely, clean out the stall and put fresh shavings and everything down, just to make sure that my horse isn't having contact with anything that another horse may have touched or had some bodily fluids on. And then avoid other horses and people. So diseases aren't just communicable from horse to horse. If somebody's walking down the barn aisle and touching this horse's nose and this horse's snotty nose and this horse's nose and this horse's snotty nose, and then coming and touching your horse, they could be transferring some diseases throughout that barn, regardless of the precautions that you're taking. So try and avoid letting your horse come to nose with another horse, or allowing people to touch your horse, especially in the face or mouth. Of course, prevention is going to be the biggest factor here. An ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. So the number one way to prevent against diseases is vaccines. So we want to make sure our horses are at least getting the core vaccines, that being rabies, tetanus, West Nile, and Eastern equine encephalitis. You may also see Western equine encephalitis in there as well. Typically, those are in a combination vaccine. So make sure your horses are getting, at least EWT vaccine and a rabies vaccine, and any other risk-based vaccines that your veterinarian may recommend. So if you're traveling a bunch, going to a bunch of shows and such, then your veterinarian may ask you to give some other vaccinations, like for EHV, rhinovirus, some other things that can be transferable from horse to horse, and you're more at a susceptible to if you're working with other horses that aren't in your barn. Vector control is also a really important part of prevention around your own operation, your own farm. The most common vector that spreads disease in horses is the mosquito. So they're responsible for transmitting all of the encephalitises, West Nile and such, to your horses. And therefore we need to make sure, especially in Florida or in the Southeast overall, that we're controlling mosquitoes as much as possible on our farms. That includes putting aerators in ponds, so we're avoiding stagnant water. Any type of water trough or such should probably have automatic waters in there, so it's getting some type of turbidity in there every day. Anything that's going to prevent those larvae from hatching in any water source is going to be important. Or if you have heavily wooded areas and such, then you should consider spraying or at least doing some type of fly spray or mosquito spray on your horses daily. So I just kind of wanted to quickly run through that, so we're not here all night. Here's my contact information. You guys will get a copy of these slides as well, so don't feel like you have to rush and write all of this down, but you're welcome to contact me whether you're in my county or not, and we'll direct you to the proper extension agent in your area that could answer your questions if we're not able to, or if you want some more individualistic information. And I will pass it on to Stephen Genowine to talk a little bit about emergency preparedness.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're good, Stephen.
Great, so I just click this and it'll move forward. Oh, all right. So I moved to North Florida from South Florida, where hurricanes were definitely a bigger part of life. It kind of blew my mind coming down up here and seeing that not every house had hurricane shutters. But anecdotally, I've kind of noticed the hurricanes are getting stronger, the season's lasting longer, and they seem to be shifting a little further north. So it's a great idea to be prepared, and hurricane season is upon us. So why should you prepare? Horses have special needs relative to other pets. They require extra consideration. They need special transport, lots of food and water. And, depending on what the situation is, if hurricane shifts at the last minute, the evacuation time can be limited. And being prepared, as opposed to not being prepared, may make the difference between being able to evacuate with your horses and being forced to leave them on site. Once you've evacuated, you have no idea of knowing when you're going to be able to return. Ideally within a few days, but there's definitely been situations where it's been much longer than that. So some things to do before a hurricane or disaster, and this is probably a good idea to do anyway. Make sure your horses are up to date on immunizations, specifically West Nile virus, Eastern equine encephalitis, and tetanus toxoid. And there could be a rush before a storm because the overall theme to this presentation is kind of don't wait till the last minute. So if you wait till the last minute, there's a storm, we're in the disaster cone, there could be a rush. You might have a harder time getting to the vet. There might be a longer line. They might run out of supplies. And following a storm, especially if you have to leave your horses on site, there's going to be more mosquitoes, potentially more diseases spreading. You also want to keep all these documents organized and ready. Most shelters might not even let you come bring your horse in without these. So, specifically, you want to have a Coggins test, veterinary papers, ID photos, medical history, allergies, if that horse has any, health certificates, insurance information, and emergency contacts. And, it's a good idea, whether you're traveling or specifically if you're staying on site, to get all of these documents and put them in something that's watertight, because if the building is destroyed or you're exposed to water, you want those documents to be preserved. It's a good idea to stock up on hay, water, feed, and any medications that a horse might need for at least several days. So a horse needs about 10 to 12 gallons of water per day, and you want to have at least 3 days. 7 is better. So, if you have the setup to have up to 7 days of forage, feed, and water, that's the best plan. So when you're going to evacuate your horses, you want to make advanced arrangements for transport and stable. As I said, don't wait till the last minute. It's a good idea to top off gas in all your vehicles. Now, if you have a trailer and you have trailer space for all of your horses, it's a good idea. But if you don't, you want to be sure to have several contingencies. Friends are great. If you have friends with trailers, especially if you have more trailer space than horses, always make sure you have a contractor, several contingencies to make sure that you've called the first 3 people on your phone to transport your horses and they all say, I can't do it. Make sure you have contingencies. Another thing to consider is if your horses aren't very accustomed to being trailered, It might be a good idea to practice before a storm so they're not panicking when the time comes and causing you a lot of time. You also want to inspect all the trailer prior to, ideally before we're in a cone, to look at the tires, the floor structure, the doors, the brake lights, etc. And also, it's a good idea to inform your friends and neighbors of your evacuation plans. And if you cannot evacuate your horses yourself, post detailed information in several locations, including office, tack room, barn entrances, etc. So another thing to do, you want to keep your halters ready to go for your horses. And you don't want to use nylon or rope halters. You want to use breakaway halters if you're going to, especially if you're leaving them on site. And you want to attach the following information to them: the horse's name, owner's name, and the contact information. You can also use water resistant livestock paint, and definitely consider microchipping as well. And I put a tag there. There's a number of services on Amazon. I think your local pet stores tend to have the tags where you can go in and just type them up, have them printed out, and just attach that to the halter. So there's a number of sources out there that talk about a good first aid kit to keep for horses. I've included most of the kind of a comprehensive list of what I've seen. And it's a good idea to prepare a portable first aid kit. And you want to check this monthly and remove expired stock. And some things you want to include would be a flashlight, thermometer, Vaseline, stethoscope, gloves, duct tape, bandage scissors, hemostats and tweezers, wire cutters, a sharp knife, ideally something that's portable. So you don't want like a giant Bowie knife in there or something. Some cold pack, clippers, a good clean bucket, clean towel, a twitch, keep the horse calm, extra lead rope and halters, syringes, a good antiseptic. This might be one of the most important, whatever your antiseptic of choice is, something like betadine, hydrogen peroxide, good saline solution to rinse wounds if they get any, bandages to dress them, and whatever medications that the horses are taking, in addition to taking like phenylbutazone, sorry, I'm not going to pronounce that right, dormosedin gel, or electrolyte paste. It's also a good idea to become comfortable with doing some basic medical procedures on your horse, in addition to being proficient with everything that's in your first aid kit. So you should be comfortable taking temperature, pulse, respirations, TPR, know what your horse's typical resting vitals are so you can kind of gauge stress or if something's wrong, know how to dress a wound on a horse, know how to wrap the legs. And like I said, the overall theme, don't wait until the last minute, know how to do this before you need to do this. So for emergency shelters, know where the shelters are ahead of time. And, there's resources here to help you, including your local extension agents. Animal care and control should be able to give you a good reference as well. Local emergency management authorities usually keep a list as well. Familiarize yourself with the sheltering locations and their particular policies and plan accordingly. Some locations will require that you bring your own panels. They may restrict or require owner care. So, know ahead of time whether you're going to need to care or whether they're not going to allow you to come on site. And they may not allow personal sheltering. So be aware that you might not be able to stay there with your horse. So then you're going to need a place to shelter for yourself. And, Alicia just talked about biosecurity. It's a good idea to minimize contact with other sheltering animals when there's a disaster. People are all sheltering in one place along with the horses. So there's potential here to spread a lot of diseases. Do not share food and interact with as little animals, ideally none, as possible. So if you have to leave without your horses, and it may be impossible for you to take your horses with you depending on what the situation is, you can shelter them in a barn or leave them loose in the field. Now, depending on the available shelters on your property, horses are often best kept out in a pasture during a storm. Only shelter them indoors if you are 100% positive that that structure is rated for the maximum sustained winds, because a shelter collapsing on or breaking up around a horse will lead to serious injury or death. You want to be familiar with the flood zones and inundated parts of your property. Move horses to drier ground if possible. You don't want them to be standing in, just sitting out there in standing water. That can become a problem. And if you shelter your horses on pasture, you can use a fly mask to prevent injury from flying debris. So keep in mind, if it's a hurricane, stuff's going to be flying all over the place. Excuse me. If something hits them in the eye, it could become a problem. So some of the things you can do to prepare your pasture in your farm: secure loose objects or just remove them. Do not place horses in pasture with electric fence, barbed wire, or power lines. If the power lines come down during a storm, that could injure or kill a horse. Place horses in the highest ground possible, the least likely to flood. If all of your pastures are very wet and prone to flood, you might want to try to shelter them in another pasture. Contact your neighbors or friends and just see if they have space. If you have vehicles, tractors, and farm equipment, it's not necessarily a bad idea to just place them out in the middle of an open field so that they don't suffer from tree falls. But then you don't necessarily want to put your horses in that same pasture either. It's also a good idea, especially if you're sheltering the horses inside, to turn off electricity to the barn and all the out structures. And this way you're going to prevent fire damage and the risk of fire damage and potentially destroying all of that. Definitely secure all your gates. And this is a really important one that I think people should definitely do. Fire ants are a problem, and they're a problem before the soil's flooded and they're all up at the surface and potentially floating around. So again, not waiting until the last minute. It's good to deal with fire ants preemptively, but if we're in a cone, it's a good time. Just make sure you get out there and take care of as many of those fire ants as you can, so they're not a problem when you're trying to deal with other issues. It's also a good idea, and if you're all farmers, you probably do this as as a matter of course of action, but make sure that you're stocked with a good saw, a great gas chainsaw, and just like with a generator, make sure they work before the storm. Don't wait until your power's out and there's a tree blocking the road to access your property to try to turn the power on and get your chainsaw running. Make sure you have hammer and nails, fencing repair materials, wire cutters, and a pry bar. So be prepared to make repairs to your fencing. They're more than likely going to get damaged. Fire extinguishers are a great thing to keep. Duct tape, store some fuel, and again, fire ant killer, because if you haven't dealt with them before, you're going to deal with them after. So after the storm, you want to inspect the horses for injury or illness. And if a horse is missing, you want to contact your local animal control office. Ensure that they have clean food and water. Beware of flooding around your well. So if you do give your horses water from a well and you see a lot of ponding and standing water around your wellhead, ideally, if your well is cased well, you're not going to have a problem with it. You should still have clean water. But if there is some surface water getting into your well, you can have problems with contamination and your horses may get sick. You also want to, all that food that you were storing preemptively, you want to inspect that to make sure that water hasn't gotten to it and spoiled it. It's, if possible, make sure all the flooding is receded before you allow the horses back into that pasture as well. Inspect all your fence lines for integrity and make sure that there's no harmful debris just sitting around in the pastures. So one other interesting thing is mud rescue. And it's a good idea to have some basic equipment for this. If especially if you have wetter pastures or there's good flooding. Plywood or boards, great thing to keep around. There's also recommended to keep a flotation device. And what I'd read was a fire hose. I know not everyone has access to a fire hose, but if your horse is stuck in the mud and the water starts rising, you want to try to give it some device to help it keep its head above that water. Having a good source of compressed air water to utilize as a mud lance to break that vacuum to help the horse get up. And there's something called the Nicopolis needle. And I don't think it's going to be practical for everyone to have one of these preemptively just for a hurricane. But if you know a neighbor or know somebody that has this equipment, it's probably good to have an idea of where you could get access to this if you needed it to help get a horse stuck out of the mud. Have some vertical lift equipment, rescue rope. And I've attached some helpful links too that summarize most of what I've talked about. And with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, so you guys are welcome to type any follow-up questions in the chat. We'd be happy to answer those. We are going to talk a little bit about our live tours. But first, I'd like to invite you to participate in our poll. If you have the ability to do that, whether you're on a phone or on the computer, you should be able to see that pop up there. And if you can answer those questions for us as extension agents, that's kind of vital for our programs. And allows us to kind of get some data from you. So just kind of while you're answering that, I wanted to invite you to our equine facility tours. We are hosting 2 of those in 2 weeks, and we'll be discussing the topics presented tonight, but unique to those operations that we're going to see. So the first one is LaRose Performance Horses. This is an operation in Jacksonville, Florida. Technically, it's kind of right on the edge there. We will be visiting this facility on April 18th, which is a Monday from 4 to 6 p.m. They're primarily a breeding and foaling facility, but they do also have quite extensive training. for performance horses. Their facility is pretty filled with amenities there for their boarding clients and their training clients and such like that. It's a really great, beautiful facility that they're, kind of invested in there. And they can have, 100 or more horses move throughout that facility through the year. So it's a pretty unique aspect there to let us come and see, how the manure management, the pasture management, biosecurity and such, and their disaster preparations apply to there when you have so many horses, so many moving parts there. So that one will be on April 18th. And then on April 20th, which is the following Wednesday, we'll be visiting the Oaks Equestrian Center in Lake City. And this is kind of an equestrian neighborhood. It's a communal facility there in the neighborhood that the residents can utilize the trails, the arenas there. They have an Olympic level cross country course. They also do lessons. I believe it's a former Olympian trainer or Olympian rider that manages the barn now, and they offer boarding lessons, horsemanship classes, all kinds of things there at the facility. And then we'll also be visiting one of the properties in the neighborhood there and kind of seeing how he manages his property as well. So if you're interested in those events, you are welcome to register at pasturettour.eventbrite.com. That event is free, and we'll be providing water and refreshments and such at both. But we hope you are able to join us. Yes, I'm not sure who asked the question, who's on the cell phone, but the video will be posted on YouTube, and I will send out that link along with the PowerPoint probably tomorrow. So you'll be able to go back and rewatch it or share this with others who might have missed tonight's program. All right, so if you don't have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to go. We want to thank you so much for attending tonight, and we hope that you would reach out to your local extension agents. If you are in North Florida, then they're all part of our North Florida Livestock Agents group. So if you're not sure how to get in contact with them, if you just Google North Florida Livestock Agents group, you'll be able to find all their contact information there on our website for each individual county. UF5's extension has an office in every single county in Florida. If you happen to be out of state as well, every state has an extension office. So this isn't just specific to Florida.